was born in the shadow of a legend, the only son of a man the world feared and worshipped. While his father built an empire of bullets and blood, the boy carried the curse of his name. He never ran the streets, never fired a gun, and yet his whole life was spent hiding from ghosts he didn't create. For 85 years, he tried to outrun history, changing his face, his name, his fate. And when he finally vanished, no one even noticed. This is not another story about Al Capone. This is the story of the man who killed the legend, not with violence, but with silence. He was born into a name already half myth and half curse. On December 4th, 1918, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, a baby cried for the first time while his father stood in the hallway, still smelling of cigar smoke and street whiskey. His mother, May Josephine Coughlin, barely 19, held him close and whispered the name that would follow him for the rest of his life: Albert Francis Capone. The press would one day shorten it to Sonny. It sounded harmless enough, almost cheerful, but the world he inherited was anything but. Some family accounts suggest that Al and May's only child was not by design, but by circumstance. According to Deirdre Capone, Al's great niece and the granddaughter of his brother Ralph, it was believed that Al became sterile later in life, a likely consequence of untreated syphilis. Other sources tell a different story, that May herself contracted syphilis from her husband, and that every attempt to have another child ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Whatever the truth, one fact remained certain. Sonny would be their first and last child, the sole heir to a dynasty that would never continue. Even at his birth, there were rumors that something was wrong. Some accounts claimed that the infection passed to the infant son, leaving behind invisible damage that doctors of the time could neither cure nor predict. No medical records survived to prove it, but the whispers persisted. What can be verified is that from his earliest years, Sonny endured severe ear infections, and that those infections would one day shape the rest of his life. For May, motherhood began with vigilance. She had married Al barely 3 weeks after the birth, both to quiet scandal and to legitimize the child. Her husband was affectionate but absent, already traveling between New York and Chicago on Torio's errands. May raised her baby largely alone, insisting that his health mattered more than the empire her husband was building. By 1920, when Prohibition transformed bootleggers into businessmen, Al Capone moved his young family to Chicago. They lived first on the South Side, then in a stately brick house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue, a home that looked ordinary from the street but bristled with guards, telephones, and armed drivers. Sonny was only a toddler, yet the neighborhood already knew who his father was. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the black Packards appeared at the curb. Inside that fortress, May tried to create normality. She filled the parlor with piano music, made the maids whisper, and instructed her son never to mention his father's work. Al, to his credit, adored the boy. Visitors later recalled the gangster dropping everything when Sonny toddled into the room. "This kid's gonna be a gentleman," Al bragged. "He ain't gonna touch none of this racket." But the infections persisted. Some nights, when the house was quiet, May would sit beside her son's bed and listen to him whimper with pain behind his left ear. Doctors came and went, offering compresses and powders that did little. By the time Sonny turned 7, the swelling had worsened. A specialist warned May that the infection could reach the brain. There was one option, a mastoidectomy, an operation that even in the 1920s carried real danger. Al agreed without hesitation. Money was no object. He arranged for the best surgeon he could find in New York, far from Chicago's watchful press. "I'll pay you $100,000 if you save him," Al told the doctor. In that operating room, Surgeons opened the bone behind the boy's ear and scraped away the diseased tissue. He survived, but at a cost. The hearing in his left ear was gone forever. From then on, Sonny lived in a world half-muted, yet the partial silence became his ally. In the noisy Capone household, where phones rang at all hours and guards whispered outside, Sonny learned to observe more than he spoke. By 1925, Al Capone had become the undisputed boss of Chicago's underworld. His income rivaled that of entire corporations. Politicians dined at his table. Journalists described him as the big fellow and Scarface. But none of that power could buy his son peace. May sent Sonny to Catholic schools under the care of priests who treated him kindly but cautiously. Teachers later remembered a polite, serious boy with immaculate handwriting and a tendency to sit at the front so he could hear better. While Al dominated headlines for bootlegging wars and gunfights, his son was learning Latin verbs and arithmetic problems, the quiet antidote to his father's noise. The contrast between father and son became striking. Al Capone wore silk suits and diamond rings. Sonny favored plain jackets and books. Al settled disputes with a gun, Sonny with silence. May made sure of it. She refused to let her son visit the hotels or casinos that funded their wealth. Instead, she filled his time with lessons and church. But the city around them could not ignore who they were. By 1929, after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, the Capone name had become shorthand for corruption itself. Reporters camped outside the Prairie Avenue home, and Sonny, only 10, had to be escorted to school by armed drivers. Children whispered about him on the playground. Some wanted to be his friend out of fascination. Others called him a criminal son. May finally convinced Al that Chicago was no longer safe for the boy. The family began spending longer stretches at their Palm Island estate in Miami Beach, purchased as both a retreat and a fortress. The white stucco mansion looked like paradise from the outside. But within its walls, May waged a constant campaign to keep her son invisible. Then came 1931. The federal government indicted Al Capone for tax evasion. The trial, the photographs, the final sentence of 11 years, all became national theater. Sonny was 12. He watched his father led away in handcuffs, and the flashbulbs seared that image into his memory. May refused to let her son attend the sentencing. She told him his father was going away for a while to rest. But even at that age, Sonny understood. The bodyguards were gone, the telephone stopped ringing, the empire had collapsed overnight. While Al served time first in Atlanta and later in Alcatraz, May and Sonny remained in Florida. The boy entered adolescence surrounded by secrecy. He was told never to answer questions about his father, never to trust reporters, and above all, never to believe what he read in the papers. For Sonny, those years became a strange mixture of comfort and isolation. The mansion was quiet now, stripped of parties and visitors. He studied under private tutors, sometimes walking along the edge of Biscayne Bay where no one recognized him. His deaf ear made him favor one side when he listened to people, a subtle tilt that gave him a contemplative air. He visited his father only rarely. Al's letters from prison when they came were short and fatherly, reminders to study hard, to be polite to his mother. But by the time the boy turned 16, Al Capone's mind had begun to deteriorate under the ravages of neurosyphilis. Prison doctors reported confusion and memory loss. The once commanding boss of Chicago could barely sign his name. When Al was finally released in 1939, transferred to his Florida home to live out his final years, Sonny was 21. The reunion was heartbreaking. The man who stepped off the train was not the father he remembered. He shuffled, spoke slowly, and mistook names. For May, the burden of care was immense. For Sonny, it was the confirmation of everything she had warned him about. Power consumed those who worshipped it. Neighbors occasionally saw the young man helping his mother lead the fragile figure of Al Capone into the sunlit garden. Sonny never complained. In later family recollections, he showed patience and respect, even when his father called him by the wrong name. Those last years of the 1930s closed one era and began another. The criminal empire was gone. The money that remained was guarded carefully by May. Sonny, newly an adult, had to decide what would come next. He could have used the family fortune to live like a prince. Instead, he applied for courses at the University of Miami, registering simply as Albert F. Capone. He studied business, kept to himself, and according to later accounts, impressed his instructors with discipline and modesty. His hearing loss, once a weakness, became part of his calm. He listened more than he spoke, giving the impression of thoughtfulness that professors admired. Few students realized who he was. Those who did quickly learned that he would end any conversation the moment his father's name arose. In the winter of 1940, a photograph taken on campus shows a tall, clean-cut young man in a jacket and tie. It's one of the few surviving images of Sonny Capone as a young adult. While America prepared for war, Sonny was preparing for something quieter, the simple, radical act of building a normal life. The war years were a time of reckoning for many families, and for the Capones, they became an era of deliberate obscurity. By 1941, Sonny Capone was 23, focused on completing his studies and quietly making a life outside his father's fading shadow. Miami had changed since the days of Al's reign. The old gang routes were gone. The speakeasies shuttered. Palm Island was still beautiful but quieter now, its white walls concealing a story the neighbors preferred not to ask about. Al Capone, debilitated and confused, wandered the garden at odd hours, greeting gardeners as though they were old friends from Chicago. Sometimes he called Sonny Albert, sometimes Boy. There were days when he didn't recognize him at all. For May, these were years of endless caretaking. For Sonny, they were a slow, painful education in decline. He had seen what power could do to a man, what fame could do to a family, and what silence could do to a legacy. Out of that wreckage, he built his character. Those who later knew him during the 1940s described him as polite, guarded, and almost painfully careful. He never bragged, never raised his voice, and rarely mentioned his father's name. When he was asked about his family, he would say only, "My father was in business. He's retired now." That was all. Among his classmates at Miami High School was Diana Ruth Casey, a bright, well-spoken girl whose southern warmth softened the boy who rarely smiled. Their friendship began in school corridors and church picnics, two ordinary teenagers in an extraordinary shadow. Against all odds, it grew into love. On December 30th, 1941, their high school romance culminated in a wedding that was anything but small. The ceremony took place at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Miami Beach, before an audience of nearly 300 guests. The city's papers took note. The son of America's most infamous gangster had married his classmate. Al and May Capone attended, though fittingly, they arrived in separate cars, avoiding spectacle. Al, already ailing, watched quietly as his only son began a life he could never have lived himself. The bride, 21-year-old Diana, was radiant, the daughter of Ruth Casey of Miami Beach and James F. Casey of Chattanooga, given away by her uncle as the Reverend William Barry performed the ceremony. It was a moment of rare normalcy wrapped in notoriety, a wedding that felt both ordinary and historic. For all the cameras and whispers, what the guests saw were simply two young people determined to make a life untouched by the sins of the past. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died in his bed at Palm Island, his mind long since gone. He was 48. Sonny was 28. He stood at his father's funeral, silent beside his mother, watching the world's cameras turn one last time toward the Capone name. It was the final act of a long public tragedy. When the funeral was over and the journalists finally left, Sonny turned his back on the empire forever. He and Diana set out to build something his father had never achieved, a peaceful, legitimate life. They settled in Miami, close enough for May to visit but far enough to feel independent. They bought a modest home, drove their own car, paid their own bills. To neighbors, they were simply Mr. and Mrs. Capone, an unassuming couple who never discussed family history. Most of their friends had no idea who Sonny's father was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Sonny took work in a series of business and clerical positions. He handled office accounts, later some local sales work. For a short period, according to public records and later accounts, he even worked as a probation officer, an ironic twist in the Capone story that Sonny himself never commented on. It was steady, ordinary employment, the antithesis of everything his surname represented. For a man raised in a house full of armed guards and bootleg fortunes, earning a paycheck honestly was both liberation and statement. He wanted to be judged by his conduct, not his bloodline. May, still strong-willed and pragmatic, admired her son's restraint, but worried about his future. To keep herself busy and to reshape the family's image, she decided to start a business, a modest Italian restaurant on Miami Beach called Ted's Grotto. It opened in 1956 and ran for about a decade. Patrons later remembered it as a cozy, family-run place where May herself worked the register, greeting guests with quiet warmth. Few recognized her. Fewer still realized that the woman taking their order was the widow of Al Capone. Sonny helped occasionally, mostly behind the scenes. He never appeared in advertisements or posed for photographs. His mother was the face. He remained the quiet hand in the background. For the first time, the Capone name was attached to something clean. The grotto paid its taxes, served its pasta, and closed its doors each night without scandal. That restaurant was more than a business. It was redemption. While May ran the grotto, Sonny and Diana were raising their 4 daughters, Veronica, Teresa, Barbara, and Patricia. Their home was simple, filled with love and rules. The girls grew up attending Catholic school, and their father insisted on one thing above all: never speak about your grandfather. They were ordinary girls in a world that would have treated them like artifacts if it had known their name. Their lives unfolded quietly beneath the Florida sun, uniforms pressed for morning mass, piano lessons in the afternoons, the faint smell of sea salt drifting in through the windows of a house that never made the papers. To their teachers and neighbors, they were the Brown family, polite, private, the kind of people who waved from a distance and kept to themselves. Inside the home, there were no photographs of Al Capone, no framed clippings, no trace of the empire that had once terrified America. May's visits were warm but guarded. She spoke little of the past, focusing instead on cooking for the girls, combing their hair, and reminding them to pray before bed. Each of the 4 sisters grew up carrying the same silent inheritance, a sense that their blood carried a story they would never tell. They laughed easily, excelled quietly, and learned early that anonymity was not a burden, but a blessing. In a city obsessed with fame and fortune, the Capone granddaughters became experts at invisibility. They married, moved, changed names, and scattered like the tide. Their father's promise kept through them. He wanted them to live without the fear or fascination that had followed him since childhood. When they asked questions, he would smile softly and say, "He was just my dad. That's all." As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, America rediscovered Al Capone. Hollywood turned his story into legend. Television dramatized his life, transforming him into a character halfway between folk hero and devil. But for the real Capone family, this revival was a curse. Each new film or book risked exposing their quiet existence. Reporters occasionally tracked Sonny down, hoping for a quote. He never gave one. He changed phone numbers, moved houses, and kept his private life airtight. The world was obsessed with the gangster. Sonny was obsessed with being forgotten. Then, in 1965, after nearly 20 years of spotless anonymity, his name appeared in the newspapers again, but for an entirely different reason. A Miami drugstore clerk accused him of shoplifting 2 bottles of aspirin and a pack of batteries worth $3.50. Sonny was in his mid-40s, a father of 4, and by all accounts, embarrassed beyond words. He pleaded no contest and received probation. When the judge asked him why a man of means would steal, Sonny reportedly shrugged and said, "Everybody has a little larceny in them." The remark, true or not, was too perfect for editors to resist. Headlines around the country screamed, "Capone's son in minor theft, a little larceny in us all." For Sonny, it was a nightmare. The case was trivial, but the name made it news. He completed probation quietly and returned home to his wife, who scolded him for weeks. The press moved on, but Sonny never forgot the humiliation. That single incident taught him that the Capone name could still draw blood long after the man himself was gone. A year later, he made a decision that would change his life once again. He filed to have the name Capone removed from his records, legally becoming Albert Francis Brown, the same alias his father had once used to hide from the law. A twist of fate that turned concealment into survival. The court approved it without objection. His lawyer later told reporters that his client was sick and tired of fighting the name. From that day forward, in official records, bank accounts, and phone directories, Capone vanished. He became Albert Brown, a quiet man in his 40s who wanted nothing more than peace. To the world, Albert Brown was just another working man in Florida. For nearly 2 years, the quiet lasted. Then, in the stormy summer of 1968, the FBI came knocking. America was unraveling. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Unrest burned through the cities. The Bureau was overwhelmed with reports of threats against public figures. Among the hundreds of names flagged in those weeks was one that caught every agent's eye: Sonny Capone. According to a later declassified summary, an anonymous tipster claimed that a man identifying himself as Sonny Capone had made a threatening call about Senator Edward Ted Kennedy from a payphone at the New England Oyster House in Coral Gables. No details, no corroboration, just a name that once ruled a city. Agents checked addresses, interviewed locals, and quickly realized the absurdity. Sonny, or rather Albert Brown, was living quietly with his family miles away. He had no record of violence, no political ties, no reason for threats. Within weeks, the investigation was closed. No charges were filed. Still, for Sonny, the damage was internal. He had done everything right, changed his name, kept his distance, lived within the law, and yet the shadow found him again. A single phone call by an unknown prankster had dragged the FBI back into his life. It confirmed what he had known since childhood. You can change your name, your city, even your voice, but you can never change your blood. After the Kennedy file was closed, he became more cautious than ever. He refused every request for comment from reporters, even for seemingly harmless "Where are they now?" features. When new films about his father appeared, Sonny unplugged his television. His daughters were instructed to say nothing if anyone ever mentioned the name Capone at school. Within a few years, the Browns became ghosts in plain sight. The family moved periodically within Florida, each time leaving little paper trail. In conversation, Sonny's accent had softened, less Chicago, more measured, as though he was trimming history from every syllable. But anonymity, for a Capone, was always temporary. By the mid-1970s, The Godfather had turned the Mafia into mythology, and historians resurrected Al Capone as its founding legend. Sonny, however, never exploited the legacy, never wrote a memoir, never once corrected the record publicly. To him, silence was both shield and punishment. Privately, he was sociable enough, attending church, chatting with neighbors, coaching his daughter's softball games. But any reference to his father ended the conversation instantly. He aged gracefully, tall, trim, hair silvering early, voice still quiet and deliberate. To a passerby, he looked like any middle-class Floridian nearing retirement. Only those closest to him knew that he was living under a borrowed surname, once used by a gangster to hide from the law. In 1986, May Capone passed away at the age of 89. She had lived long enough to see her son succeed at the impossible, a Capone without scandal. The woman who had once managed bodyguards and accountants died peacefully in Florida, leaving behind a modest estate, a handful of personal possessions, and a family line untainted by crime. For Sonny, her death was both grief and liberation. He had been her protector for decades, the quiet keeper of the family's second life. With her gone, he became the last surviving link to the inner Capone circle, the last person who had known Al Capone not as legend, but as father. Reporters tried again to find him after May's passing. A few succeeded in tracking down addresses listed under Albert F. Brown, but each time they knocked, the story ended at the threshold. A polite refusal, a closed door. When new biographies of Al Capone appeared, Sonny refused interviews from every author who reached out, including prominent historians like John Kobler and later Jonathan Aig. The pattern was always the same: polite decline, no comment, click. As the years passed, the life Sonny built with Diana quietly unraveled. Whether through distance, loss, or the simple erosion of time, their marriage eventually ended. Not with headlines or scandal, but in silence. By the late 1980s, he had moved west, settling under his legal name, Albert Francis Brown, in the secluded hills of Northern California. The destination was carefully chosen, far from the coast that obsessed over mob folklore, far from the humid streets that had witnessed his father's decline. He bought a small home in Auburn Lake Trails, a quiet gated community tucked into the Pine Hills of El Dorado County. There, nobody recognized him. Neighbors knew him as Al Brown, a retired salesman who liked gardening, kept to himself, and always waved back. It was there, according to later accounts, that he met America Amy Francis, a woman as private as he was. No record survives of a ceremony. Some say they married quietly, others that she simply stayed by his side. However it began, she became his final companion, protective, cautious, and fiercely devoted to guarding the peace he had spent his whole life building. By now, Sonny was an old man, though still strong. He spent mornings reading the newspaper, afternoons tending his yard, and evenings on the porch with Amy. When the last newspaper finally stopped calling, Sonny achieved what few descendants of notorious men ever could: complete disappearance. There were no scandals, no exposés, no whispered rumors of secret fortunes. The Capone bloodline had become, at last, ordinary. By the time the 1990s arrived, Albert Francis Brown had spent more than 4 decades out of the public eye. He and Amy lived modestly in their single-story home surrounded by pines. He attended local community meetings, paid his taxes on time, and was on friendly terms with the postman. Nothing about him suggested scandal or history. His daughters had grown up and scattered across the country, living ordinary lives, carrying surnames that concealed the one history book still whispered. By the 1990s, Sonny was in his 70s. His health was steady, though age had softened him. He read the newspaper every morning, always the local one, never national, and watched the evening news in silence. The world, that had once obsessed over his father, now obsessed over politicians, celebrities, and new scandals. The age of prohibition was ancient history. When a television special occasionally mentioned Al Capone, Sonny simply turned the channel. Friends who visited the Browns in Auburn Lake Trails remembered a man of calm manner and gentle humor. He offered coffee, asked about their families, and never raised his voice. He was private, but not unfriendly, cautious, but kind. If anyone ever hinted that he might be related to that Capone, he smiled and deflected. "Nah, I just get that a lot." And the conversation would move on. Those who lived near him only learned the truth after his death. Until then, he had succeeded at the impossible, living an entire lifetime under one of America's loudest names without ever being noticed. When reporters in the early 2000s attempted to trace the descendants of Al Capone, they found only dead ends. Albert Francis Capone no longer existed in public records. Albert Francis Brown did, but he looked like any other retiree in El Dorado County. It was as if the bloodline had vanished. That, in a sense, was Sonny's greatest victory. On July 8, 2004, in the quiet of his California home, Albert Francis Brown passed away. He was 85 years old. The cause was natural, the setting peaceful, the coverage minimal. No obituaries in the national papers, no documentaries, no retrospectives, no headlines announcing the end of the Capone lineage. Just a short local notice listing his name, his date of death, and a burial record. Albert Francis Brown, 1918 to 2004. There was no mention of Al Capone. The final irony was perfect. The son of America's most notorious gangster had managed to die the way his father never could, privately, quietly, and free. He left behind his wife, Amy, the woman who had guarded his anonymity for years. In later interviews, attributed to her by secondary sources, she defended her husband fiercely. "Al Capone's been dead a long time. His son had nothing to do with him. Let him rest in peace." It was the only public statement ever made on Sonny's behalf, and it said everything. After his death, researchers and journalists tried to piece together his story, but there was little to find. No personal letters, no memoirs, no interviews. Even the FBI files on him, thin folders tucked away among tens of thousands, contained only routine notes. Investigations closed. No further action. Sonny Capone had spent 85 years being the one thing his father could never be: invisible. Yet invisibility has its own form of immortality. Because in the absence of scandal, people began to wonder, who was this man who walked away from the most powerful name in organized crime? What had it cost him to live without a past? The few who met him near the end of his life remember a man who carried no trace of bitterness. He had made peace with what he could not change. To some, that seemed heroic, the quiet resistance of a man who refused to be the story the world wanted. To others, it was tragic. A son so burdened by his father's shadow that he had to erase himself to survive. But to Sonny, it was neither. It was simply life. He had once watched his father lose his mind, his freedom, and his dignity. He had seen his mother sacrifice everything to protect a family the world wanted to destroy. He had lived through the era of headlines, the trials, the exile, the resurgence of the myth. And through it all, he had chosen silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because silence for him was control. The myth of Al Capone would live forever, but the man who had shared his blood was gone, leaving behind no legacy, no confession, and no apology. And perhaps that was the point. Sonny Capone's life was not about crime, fame, or rebellion. It was about endurance. He had inherited a story written in violence, and he refused to let it continue. In the end, there was no mansion, no entourage, no empire, only a quiet home surrounded by trees and a man content to watch them grow. He had been born under a name that defined an age, and he died under one that meant nothing at all. That is the quiet triumph of Sonny Capone, the boy who came into the world as a symbol of power and left it as proof that peace is sometimes the loudest victory of all.